Happy to be here.
Yeah. Well, it's so great to talk to you, Christine. You had this like amazing post on LinkedIn a few weeks back. And I'll just read the beginning of it and maybe you can contextualize kind of what you were talking, because for me it resonated, but I'd really like to hear from you. Where you said, today marks my 6th anniversary at Handshake and remains the best career decision I ever made. Besides my close friends, most people don't know the volume of skepticism and doubt I faced from colleagues in career services when I first announced I'd be joining Handshake. What lessons can institute? Oh, sorry, that's the end of it. But like, so curious for me, like, what, like, can you contextualize what you meant by that, and maybe we'll use that as a jumping off point.
Yeah. So when I decided to join Handshake 6 years ago, I think our profession in particular really viewed vendors and technology providers as separate from the work that we did. They were there to serve us. They were there because we paid them to be there. But there was much more of a vendor mentality than there was a partner mentality.
Mm.
And when I decided to move from higher education into the tech sector and to be part of one of these technology partners, I was really worried, honestly, about whether or not my colleagues and my peers and people that I had very much sort of built my career with and around would still see me as someone who was credible, knowledgeable, and a real partner in this work. Because to me, it relies for us to be able to do this well, it relies on all of us with our different areas of expertise to actually tackle different problems in different ways with different approaches and to come together to actually help move the needle and change things for our students. I don't believe, I've never believed, even when I was just in higher education, that higher ed alone was going to solve that problem by itself. It requires everybody. And so I was hopeful, but I knew the amount of skepticism I faced because I heard it. People asked me a lot of questions about, are you sure you want to do this? Is this really the right choice? Will you ever be able to come back if you decide you don't like it? Um, you're going to the other side, right? Like I heard all of these comments. And it was important to me that in the time that I started at Handshake, that I both establish um, continue to grow and establish my own credibility and knowledge in the field and around the trends and issues that we face. And when I say we, I still am referring to the collective we of
Yeah.
higher education, technology, workforce, government,
Mm.
policy, like all of these individuals are part of the we. And I hope that in the 6 years I have been here and done this work, that I have been able to prove to colleagues that it is possible to remain credible and knowledgeable and to be able to be a true partner in how we get this work done.
Yeah, that's incredibly well said. Where do you see that disconnect, right? Because like that there is this sort of rampant skepticism that I see. I certainly heard similar things when I was sort of making this sort of transition from like working at a university to just like deciding to sort of go out on my own. And a lot of sort of questions like, are you okay? Like, did you get fired? No, I didn't get fired. Like, I wanted to do something different. I want to serve in different ways. What what have been some lessons that about sort of like bridging those two worlds together, or not two worlds, but lots of disparate spaces
Yeah,
together?
yeah. Well, I think part of it is just simply the language and the words that are used in these two
Mm.
different spaces. And so sometimes there's a perceived disconnect or difference when in reality, there's actually more similarities than people would assume. We
Mm.
just use different words, right? So in higher education, you're talking about your stakeholders. In a business or an industry, you're talking about your customers, right? You have a board for higher education. Honestly, you have a board when you have a company as
Totally.
well. You have to bring in tuition dollars because you have a bottom line and you have to be able to operate the university. For a company, you have revenue and you need to be able to use that to operate. So there are more similarities than I think people sometimes realize. But honestly, I think people get held up on the tax status,
Yeah.
the difference between a nonprofit and a for profit. And the reality is, you could really think of a nonprofit as being for impact, right? And so it's purely a tax status. You can work towards a double bottom line in an organization or an industry where you are trying to make an impact and you are also bringing in revenue. Like both things can be true. And I think a lot of the skepticism sits there. I think there's a lot of doubt around, can you actually really care about
Mhm.
students or really care about the mission if you also care about money? And I think the reality is, yes, you can. But because money is not talked about necessarily in that way in the higher education setting, for anyone who hasn't worked outside of higher education, they don't necessarily have a frame of reference for that. And so I think naturally there's a little bit more skepticism because it's unknown and it's different.
Yeah, yeah, I love that answer a lot, and I think it just speaks to that ability to sort of create alignment. And I love the sort of grounding of just like simply using language and how you're sort of finding that to sort of find those easy things that really
Yeah.
sort of compart between the two. How did you do the bridge building? And this is something that I see a lot of sort of institutional leaders struggling with is, we've got AI on the horizon, or not even on the horizon. I mean, so many of
It's
us are should just have it baked into your daily work. It's just part of the flow, right?
yeah.
Um, I could say that it's sort of on the ground or anecdotally, I see the sort of the uptake of different sort of tools, even these sort of easier functionality, wildly sort of different at at institutions. And I think leaders are like really struggling to like, how do I sort of like take this, this like crazy emerging tool that's going in all these different directions, and agentic AI and interoperability of systems and things that we're sort of moving towards a more sort of agent model right now. I'm so curious from you because like you're sitting at this like really interesting intersection of a very traditional industry, higher education, with venture and tech and all of that. Like, how have you found like wins in sort of making those two very different worlds meet and still like drive value, drive partners, and sort of do the things that you want to do for both?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it really kind of comes down to honestly like basic human psychology. So psychology was actually my background,
Mhm.
um, and what I studied. And I think if you really get down to the very core, people want to understand how it benefits them. People
Mhm.
want to understand how it's going to impact them. And so when you're introducing something new, it's important to be able to frame it in a way that allows someone to see themselves in the new thing that you're
Yeah.
introducing. So, what is their new role going to be? How do they need to adapt? What will their value be? How will they use it? What is the benefit to them? Those are all the types of questions that I think myself and my team and everyone here at Handshake is always trying to think about. We often talk about the fact that we're a three-sided marketplace.
Mhm.
Many marketplaces that you use in your daily life are two-sided. And we have the unique challenge of being three-sided because we
Yeah.
have our education partners, our employers, and our students. And so we're always trying to think of how does this new thing that we might be rolling out benefit all three sides of the marketplace? How does it help all three to achieve their goal? And how does it help us as a company to be able to move forward? And I think that's a really big piece of it is articulating the benefit and the value and the role for someone so that they can see themselves in that change.
Yeah, I love that answer. I mean, I think you have to really sort of think about what's in it for the person and how do you sort of stack incentives and those kind of things to really sort of meet that. Have you found like data points that are like really useful in that? Because like I have to assume that's like so tricky where you've got, like vastly different sort of metrics for each person that you're sort of trying to do. Like what have
Yeah.
you found like helpful from like a measurement perspective there?
Sure. So I think one new thing that we've rolled out fairly recently that I think has really resonated with our partners is something that we call customized collections.
Hmm.
It's a way for our schools to curate information to their students. So they can curate jobs, they can curate employers, they can now curate events. And in the coming months, they'll be able to also curate posts. So let's just take, for example, Mike, a career center that has the career community or career cluster model, right? So they
Hmm.
have different career communities for different industry areas that their students might be interested in. And let's say they are focused on, we'll choose an easy one where there's always students that want to go into it, finance. Finance, consulting, iBanking. Okay, so you have a
Totally.
community for that. So now, as a school, let's take my previous institution, Wellesley. I can curate specific employers or jobs, alumni, events, posts that are about finance, iBanking, consulting, and I can put it into this collection. And what we've been able to show our partners is that those collections are getting 7x the number of views, clicks, and applications,
Nice.
right? And so their expertise, their curation does matter to students.
Yeah.
Students do want to see what your school is suggesting or recommending. It doesn't mean they don't want to be able to see all the other stuff. They want to have the ability to find it if they want to find it, but they really do care about what schools are curating. And so that is one of the ways in which we benefit the entire network because we provide greater customization and personalization that is related to your school affinity, which students like. And it helps our partners to see that their role is shifting towards being more of a curator
Yeah.
instead of being a gatekeeper, right? No longer do students need to go through the gates of career services to get information. They
Mm.
can get that information on their own laptops, on their own phones. They can get it everywhere and anywhere. So now instead, the role of someone in career services has changed. They don't need you to be the holder of information. They need you to be someone who can help make sense of the information that is out there, add value to that information, and give them something more than they could have gotten through their own normal Google search.
Yeah, that is such a win because it stacks, for everybody, right? What's like the process of sort of rolling something like that? And what's the sort of what are the testing phases look like, and then what's the sort of deployment aspect on your end to make sure that it's sort of like hitting the wins for the three markets?
Yeah, everything's very cyclical. So it
Yeah.
starts with obviously identifying a problem. What is changing or what needs to change in order to be better? In this situation, we knew that students were not accessing a lot of jobs. There was a
Mm.
high volume of jobs on Handshake, but every individual average student was only getting a small percentage of them because
Totally.
of the old model of approving and declining jobs.
Yep.
And so we knew that was a problem. And the only way that we could ensure more students were getting more opportunities that they were interested in so that they could get better outcomes was to
Mm.
increase what they were able to see and have access to. So we started from there and we started brainstorming essentially what were the ways in which we could increase liquidity for the network and for our
Mm.
students. We diverge in all of those ideas and look at all of the various possibilities. And then we start to hone in on ways that we can do that that benefit each of the different parties. For
Mm.
us, we actually bring our EDU partners into the process fairly early. So we do something called mini advisory boards around different features or different topics in the product, and we bring together a group of usually somewhere between 20, 25, sometimes 30 institutions that span across 4-year, 2-year, large, small, public, private, kind of all the different demographics, and we present to them the problem. We present to them the feedback that we've gotten from students because we're students first. So that's one of our first values. So we always provide that. And we essentially start to lay out for them, these are some of the various possibilities of how we might go about solving this problem. And we get their thoughts, we get their feedback. Then we go back to the drawing board, we incorporate that in, and we continue meeting with them throughout the process in designing what essentially becomes the solution. And then from that point forward, we start to share with the masses, right? All 1,600 partners in usually a webinar format. First, here are some of the things that are coming down the road. Here are things
Hmm.
that are coming down the roadmap 6 months from now, a year from now, to start to get folks wrapped around what
Yeah.
is coming. And then I think part of it is literally exposure. We have to talk about it multiple times. People aren't always going to understand it the first time. They need to hear it multiple times, right? You mentioned that you're doing a lot of work in marketing with a lot of the schools that you're working with. It's the same concept. You need
Totally.
exposure, you need repetition. And then we, of course, always beta. test everything. So we do that with another small group of schools, usually about 100 to 200 beta schools. And then we take that feedback, we continue to tweak it, and then we make those changes before we do a larger rollout. With the rollout, sometimes we roll out to a percentage of schools first, kind of see how that goes, and then we open it up further. Sometimes we go ahead and do what we call a GA launch, which is a general launch to everybody after the beta. So that one varies a little bit depending on the feature.
Yeah, I mean that roadmap makes a ton of sense though, and gives you I think a plug and play iterative way to sort of do things, soft launch them, so to speak, test, work out bugs, and then sort of get people sort of ready for for what's coming next.
Exactly.
Switching gears a little bit, you you're like way it seemingly really ahead of sort of the trends in career services and where you see things going. You mentioned the sort of like the gatekeeper model, and I love the way that you sort of were able to sort of build that into the product so that you could have a more sort of curated aspect of it and fit the sort of like challenges of sort of information asymmetry and things that I think people have sort of like had trouble to pivoting to in this space. Like, what are some shifts that you've seen happening, and then how do you think institutions can adapt to them?
Well, I think there's a few things over the course of the past decade that I've seen, and I'll mention them because I think there's a pattern to all of this, right? So back 10 years ago, when Handshake first came onto the market, what most of our colleagues in career services, ourselves included, Mike, what we were used to were closed enterprise systems. You
Yes,
would buy a closed enterprise
totally.
system, right? And as an employer, you had to log into all these different enterprise systems to post your job multiple times. And the notion of putting your employers or your jobs for your students onto a network that was shared was
Yeah,
really scary.
really
I
tough.
remember the conversations back then when a lot of our colleagues were highly skeptical and they
Yeah,
were really worried that if they did this, they would lose all their employers, they would lose all their jobs, and none of
yes,
their students would get hired, right? Like that was the concern at the time. And I think, you know, that mentality is a little bit of a zero sum game sort of
yeah,
mentality. And I think the reality is when you're talking about access and trying to help all students be able to get greater access to all opportunity, it's actually not a zero sum game. And our data proves that as new schools came on, every new school that joined Handshake increased the number of employers and job and internship opportunities by over 200, sometimes 300%
yeah.
in the
Network
first year.
effect.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because of the network effect, right?
yeah.
And so that fundamentally was one of the first major shifts and changes within career services just in the past decade. And now, if you think about it, people don't bat an eye about it.
Yeah,
Nobody
totally.
thinks twice about the fact that you're joining a network. In fact, it's a pretty big plus, right? And
Mhm.
people find it pretty normal. But the reason I use this example first is because the pattern that happens is a new thing is introduced. People are scared and skeptical because
Yep.
it's unknown. You start to get a few early adopters and innovators to do it. Then the rest of the major majority starts to join them. And you hit a tipping point where now it becomes the norm. And that is almost always the exact same pattern for pretty much every new change that is introduced. It's introduced, there's skepticism, you get a few early people to adopt it and to show you that it can work, and then you start to get more people over the hump. And so that was one of the first things. I think another one was certainly the example I gave you earlier around this notion of more curation. And I think one that we're working on right now is really about content creation, and it's about the feed. So we know that Gen Z consumes information differently than we did as millennials or Gen Xers or boomers. And we have to find a way to keep their attention and to still directly connect into their line of thinking, their line of consumption, because otherwise they're consuming other information elsewhere. And I would honestly, if they're going to scroll on something, I would rather them scroll on Handshake around career material,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
And so, how do we help our partners, quite frankly, to stay relevant, right? It would be really easy for our entire profession to potentially become irrelevant if they don't keep adapting to the ways
Mm.
in which our students, our current students, like to consume information. And so, what we want to do is literally provide the channels for our partners to stay relevant, to
Mm.
stay plugged in, and to be able to help students get the information that a lot of times they don't even know they need to ask because they're going through it for the first time. And so, the value and expertise of our partners, of our EDU partners, is so immense. I want to keep finding ways to plug them in directly. And I literally just said this on a webinar last week to our partners. My hope is that in 3 years, if we've done our job well at Handshake, we will have created a consumer product that is so sticky and intuitive and seamless for students that they will find so much value. They will be there, they will want to be there, they will tell their friends about it. And none of my higher education institutions will have to spend their very precious and valuable time trying to get students onto a platform. Instead, they can spend their time creating the content that those students need, and
Mm.
they can spend their time engaging one-on-one with those students who actually really need that help and support. And they can spend their time creating the right programming and events for those students to meet the employers and the alumni that they actually want to meet. That is a really valuable use of our colleagues' expertise. And that's what I want to be able to build for them.
That is super cool, and I love the way that you're sort of essentially freeing up time for staff members to do things that are just more nuanced and that require unique and nuanced expertise. And tech is sort of, I think, solving a lot of those background challenges. It strikes me that that has to be like a massive UX challenge, right? Because it's like you've got such a you know a very sort of quickly changing student demographic, and you have to do a lot of sort of like testing and things and feedback to sort of make sure that new product features, but sort of products overall is sort of meeting those expectations. But then you've also got, because of the marketplace concepts, you've got employers, you've got partners that you're sort of doing, and you have to have a sort of probably a different lens for sort of each of those pieces of it. What's the mentality around that, around sort of creating and designing things that like work for everybody, and how do you sort of balance that, the sort of the pieces of that?
Yeah, I think for us, we're really continuing to move towards having more of, in marketing terms, a consumer narrative
Yeah,
and consumer persona, so that it is actually just one rather
yeah,
than three separate ones, but
yes.
something that is consistent. And so we've been very transparent and we've been very direct with all three sides of our marketplace that we want Handshake to be the platform, the place for early talent. And we want it to be the platform for Gen Z because Gen Z is the emerging population in our workforce right
Mm.
now. And so we need to do that. And we need to be very intentional around how we attract that particular population because they are the largest and fastest growing population in our workforce today. And just last year, they officially overtook the number of baby boomers in the workforce, right? So it's happening, it's growing
Yeah.
significantly. And so I think that that piece is really important. Obviously, when it comes to the actual building of specific product features, we are always paying very close attention and talking to our employer partners, talking to our higher education partners to really understand what are you trying to do? What's the problem you're trying to solve? And how do we build something that both helps the marketplace and helps the students, but also helps you with your workflow and what
Mm.
you're trying to create. But I think when we really look at the marketing and the narrative, we try to be really consistent around who we are.
Yeah. I like that. What advice would you have for like institutional leaders that like just struggling with the sort of complexity of onboarding new processes, budget cuts, all these sort of different sort of pieces that I think we're seeing some changes in the higher ed marketplace where his and I guess these been a long time coming, but the sort of middle market is sort of like kind of quickly disappearing. We've got demographic cliff of 15-ish% of students that are enrollment drops. I think we've got a lot of places that are going to continue to have to sort of close or sort of reposition or completely sort of reimagine. What are your advices for places that are just really struggling to find that sort of niche in place? And how does a platform like yours sort of uniquely add value to students, to employers, to experiences, to sort of like be an agent that is going to sort of like help sort of push them in the direction they need to go?
Yeah, let me actually answer your question kind of in two different ways, one
Yeah.
more broad and then one more specific to
Mm,
Handshake. The broader answer, I think, is it's always important for teams, institutions, leadership to remain nimble and resilient
mm,
and to be willing to rethink what your value proposition is. That's really, really key. And Mike, I know you doing all of this work in helping a lot of these schools do their marketing. It's probably part of your repertoire and what you're telling them all the
definitely.
time. But really having a good hard look at what is your current value proposition. If the world around you has changed and people can get X, Y, and Z in other places, why do they come to you? What is it that you can uniquely bring them that nobody else can? And be willing to actually let go of the things that are no longer unique to you anymore. I think that is really actually a big lesson in staying adaptable and reinventing yourself. It's something that I've told students for years when I've advised them in career advising is to reinvent yourself means you have to be willing to kind of let go of some of the things you did before to make room for doing new things
Mm,
that are more relevant at this particular point in time. So I think that is a big piece kind of broadly. And I think partnerships is another unique way that institutions could be thinking about that too. So maybe you are not the expert in X area, but the school down the road is, and they're kind of in a similar boat to you. Is there a way that you could partner? Um, is there a way that you could scale your resources? Is there a way that you could streamline some things for your students so that they can get the best of both worlds, but you personally at your institution don't have to try to be all things to all people, as you actually said early in our conversation today. So I
yeah.
think that's my take on the broad question. I think the second part of the question is sort of Handshake and how can Handshake help to provide value to some of these institutions. So I think first and foremost, we provide access for your students. I think when you are a
Huge.
student that goes to an institution that perhaps is not the state flagship or the Ivies or sort of the top 50, right? You need access to great opportunities. There are so many smart, talented, intelligent students that go to these institutions, but they don't have the same introductions, they don't have the same access, they don't have the same pathways into some of these different industries or fields or employers. And that's what we provide is an opportunity for those students to be able to meet those employers and vice versa. Those employers often want that talent, they just don't know where to go to get them. And so I think we can provide a lot of that. The second thing that we can provide is data. We sit on a treasure trove of data and information that would be so helpful for any institution. I'm thinking the dean of admissions, I'm thinking the VP of enrollment management, I'm thinking the president or the provost that can really allow them to tell a more compelling story around their success or their students. But in order to tell that story, you need to provide those students with actual access to these jobs and employers. And that's what we can do. So by using Handshake, you'll have a lot of that data and you'll be able to help put that together in a compelling way. And I think that's really key. And then the third part is perhaps more operational and kind of day to day. When we roll out new technology and new features, what is hard sometimes for partners is that it requires them to rethink their workflows. It requires them to rethink how they might do something operationally. But on the flip side of that, I talk to my son all the time about mindset. We're actually also providing an opportunity. We're providing you an opportunity to flex that muscle, right? To choose to say, wow, okay, we can do this a different way. How could we actually change the way that we do this, right? That is actually a choice that every partner gets to make every single day when they go to work. And I know that that's not always easy, and you have to build that muscle sometimes slowly with your teams. But the point is, there's no better time than now to start. Just do a little bit every day, and you're able to start to actually really change and adapt. And once you get that muscle under you, and I know this from, I worked at two different institutions where I was hired in to specifically help lead transformational change at both institutions. Once you start to build that muscle within your team, it will keep going, and you will be able to have a team that is nimble, that is resilient, that is adaptable to change, because they've now built the capacity for doing that. And when they look at things, when they look at new challenges, when they look at changes that are coming, they will no longer see them as obstacles, they will see them as opportunities. And they will be able to think in a different way around, how could I change this up? And so I think that's exciting. But it takes a little work and a little patience and a little persistence to get there.
That's incredibly well said. I couldn't agree more. And the sort of the focus on the training and the mindset, and really sort of getting people to sort of see these challenges as opportunities. And there's like these weird tweaks I think like leaders can do in terms of like what you celebrate or give attention to. Like there's this great book I read. I'm blanking on the name, but it's I think it's called "You Are What You Do" or something to that effect. Silicon Valley book on leadership, but really sort of gets to the heart of like the talking points and what people are actually saying. Like matters very little relative to like the actions that people are taking. And people are paying very, very close attention to the actual actions and paying less attention to the sort of lip service, because their incentives drive everything, kind of to the point you made earlier. So these little things about sort of celebrating, celebrating people that are sort of taking risks or trying new things, or like giving like attention and praise to that, or like finding the small little sort of iterative things. And even if it doesn't work, just sort of like owning and celebrating that and owning experimentation, like all these sort of little things that you can do that have like outsized, outsized leverage to like what you're actually trying to do, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to maybe just sort of pick your brain on like, what's the future of career services look like to you, and where do you see Handshake sort of in that space? Like if you had to project out 5-10 years, where do you see things going, and what do you see as your role in that?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the big pieces is career services is going to continue to be more and more critical to the success of any institution moving forward. I think when you think about the amount of skepticism that people have right now around the value of higher education, I believe one of the main ways to bring that back around is to show them the value and the return on investment of that education. I don't mean that in that schools only need to have certain types of majors or certain types of programs. I'm actually a huge believer in the liberal arts. But what I do mean is that we must talk in a way that actually translates and resonates with the general public. And I think we've kind of lost some of that.
Yeah.
I think that's a marketing challenge, quite frankly. I think we need to, as an entire entity, as higher education, I think we need to own the narrative of who we are. We need to articulate that value in words that are not higher ed speak, but general public speak, so that people can see and really garner for themselves, wow, this is why it's useful. This is why it's valuable. This is what I'm getting out of it. And I think career services, quite frankly, will play a really big role in that, if an institution is smart, because what career services can do is help increase recruitment. It can help with revenue. It can help with reputation, which ultimately helps with ranking, right? Like these are all the things. I always say that career services, if done correctly, can actually help impact the 4 R's of an institution. Those are the 4 R's. I do think that in order for career services to do that, though, there are a couple things that need to happen on both sides. So on the leadership side, you got to give career services a seat at the table. You don't always have to provide a lot of resources. As much as I would love to advocate for tons of resources for career services, I know that not all institutions at the moment have extra resources to allocate. What you can do that is completely free is to give your leader of career services a seat at the table. A seat at the table with your deans, a seat at the table with your provost or associate provost, a seat at the table with your cabinet, to really emphasize the importance and the connectivity of career with curriculum and how you think about that. You could build in feedback loops, right? I think actually our 2-year institutions do a really fantastic job of this, where a lot of them have industry advisory boards for many of their programs where employers are plugged in and actually providing real time feedback on the skills and the competencies that they're seeing of the graduates that are coming out and going into work at their workplaces and what that looks like and what is the new technology or the new things that they're teaching or doing in their workplaces, and how can that be infused back into the classroom, right? That doesn't always mean changing curriculum, but it might mean a change in how you frame that curriculum. It might mean a change in the examples that you use in helping students to understand things. There are lots of different nuances to how this can look. So I think that's a big piece of it is making sure the right people are at the table and making sure that you're actually being open to changing some of the ways in which you've done things at your institution for some time. Now, on the other side, career services leaders, it's important that you actually build the skills of navigating the politics of your institution. You have to be an incredibly strong communicator of the vision, the direction, and the work that you and your team are doing. So if you're not a strong verbal and or written communicator, that's something to work on right now. You have to know how to build bridges and build relationships because so much of what you're doing requires influence, not positional power, right? And you have to be fairly data savvy. And if you are not personally data savvy in pulling that data, analyzing the data yourself, you need to know how to hire someone on your team that can do that. And what you need to be able to do is craft the story around that data so that you can tell that compelling vision to those above you, around you, beside you, right? Is going to be really key. So I think those are some of the things that I still see as the future of where career services is going. I think Handshake plays a huge role in that. From quite frankly, the most basic baseline core value, which is we want your students to have great outcomes, just like you want your students to have great outcomes. We are literally driving towards the same thing, which is your students getting employed at the employers that they want to be at, right? And so the best way to do that is to ensure that they actually have access to all of those employers, to all of those opportunities. And then the second part, which I talked about a little bit earlier, is we sit on all of that data. So now we can provide that back to you. One of the big marquee projects that we're doing this year in 2025 is actually around outcomes. So we recognize that because we're sitting on so much good data, we actually can provide sourced outcomes that help to supplement every school's first destination outcomes, right? Based on Handshake profiles, based on public profiles, based on employer sourced data that we have proprietary access to, we can give our schools greater insight into where their students are going even before they are surveyed. And we're really excited to be able to work on that and to be able to provide that for our partners. We learned recently that we actually have 2x the number of profiles for recent graduates and early talent than any other platform out there. And so that's pretty exciting. Those are things that we have proprietary access to that we're now going to be able to surface to our partners in a more meaningful way.
That's incredible. What excites you? Maybe a great place to close would be like, what excites you about the road ahead? I mean, it seems like you guys are building really incredible pieces and, layering onto core product and adding value in unique ways, supporting and augmenting the broader value proposition that higher ed and career services offer. But like, what personally gets you really excited?
Oh, I mean, it's the same thing that brought me to Handshake in the first place, which is being able to actually meet this mission of increasing access to opportunity for all of our students. It feels more personal to me these days. My son is 12, and in the next 6 years, he too will be in college, and he will be looking for his first internship. He'll be looking for his part-time job, and at some point, looking for his first job out of school. And I want to make sure that we are building a product that I am proud of him using, something that's actually going to help him to locate and to build his network, to find the types of things that he's most interested in. And we've got a few more years to do that before he opens the app and starts using it himself.
But that is awesome. Well, I think that's an awesome place to end. Thank you, Christine. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.